I'm not doing this thing. This is not my purpose here to do a thing in relative to the Cardinals of sitting here and saying, well, it could be a lot worse. Yeah, look at those Padres. They have a losing record, Look at Seattle, who was supposed to be pretty damn good. They're 10 games out. I mean, look at the Mets. They spent $270 million. Steve Cohen. Look at them. And you can just play this game by going all around. And it has nothing to do with the Cardinals. I mean, the Cardinals are responsible for their own problems. However, and you also have the defending American League champions, the Phillies. They're under 500. So there's some bad stuff going on all over the place in terms of expectations. But anyway, the New York Mets. Now that's an interesting situation. They've lost 6 in a row. They played Toronto at home and lost 3 straight, and they go down to Atlanta and get swept, and that was really damaging. Well, it was also extra frustrating because their bullpen just kept coughing up leads down there. And so you look up, and it's not just 6 in a row. The Mets have lost 10 out of their last 15. So this isn't just a bad week. They're sitting there 30 and 33, and they're 8.5 games out. Now, the Cardinals are 8.5 games out in the Central, and this is kind of my point. Would you rather be the Mets at 8.5 games out of their division lead when they got Philadelphia and a very good and surprising Marlins team in front of them before you even get back to Atlanta, but to be 8.5 games down to Atlanta already? All due respect to the Brewers, because everyone listens to me knows how much I think about them in terms of how smart that front office and their manager is. I'd much rather be 8.5 games behind Milwaukee rather than 8.5 games behind the Atlanta Braves, especially because the teams between the Mets and the Braves are also really, really good. Skip Schumacher, this is another story that has turned out to be a great story in this season. Miami's 35 and 28. And I don't know where I came up with that. I think maybe I got to put my glasses on. Anyway, you got a lot of talent in that division. The Phillies will rise and they'll play well. They did it last year. But, man, at least the Cardinals have an easy way to navigate. But really, also the Mets will not have Pete Alonso for, 2 or 3 weeks or maybe longer. He's got a bone bruise on his wrist. So it's going to keep him out of action. And he's a prodigious home run RBI guy, so that's a blow as well. There's been a lot of grumbling in New York about Buck Showalter. If people are trying to put together a list of managers to kind of be on the watch list for saying bye-bye, I think he's on it, but I trust Ken Rosenthal, who at The Athletic discussed this, and he doesn't think that Steve Cohen, the owner, who has laid out $265 million in payroll this year for a 30 and 33 team that's lost 10 out of 15 and is 8.5 behind the Braves. He's not a guy that will suffer these kind of things with a lot of patience. But what this may mean, I agree with the sentiment. And again, Rosenthal wrote a really excellent piece about this, The Athletic. It's like, this is not the kind of guy, somebody that spends $265 million on this year's payroll alone is not the kind of guy to put his feet up, relax, kick back, get in the recliner, have a beverage. No, that ain't him. Considering his career as a hedge fund manager and the action and just this incredibly high standard for success that's made him a billionaire many times over. So the Mets are going to be interesting to watch, not only on the field, but just in terms of an experiment of, can you still buy a World Series? You can, but it's not as easy as people make it out to be. I did a thing a while back. I don't have it here because I did it going into last season's postseason. And, I looked at the most recent teams, 7 or 8 of them, 9 of them maybe, who won 100 games plus in a season and then really didn't. Most of them just, kind of flopped out during the postseason. So your payroll does matter. I'm not going to sit here and say it doesn't matter, but it also doesn't ensure anything. It does not guarantee anything. So, and And I always think that thing is fun because we talk about this in St. Louis a lot. Do I think Bill DeWitt's payroll should be higher? Yeah. And I think it should be specifically focused and targeted on some areas of need and areas that, frankly, have been neglected. We're talking about starting pitching. So I don't need Bill DeWitt to spend $265 million. I know a lot of people say, well, why not? And you're right. I mean, it's not my money. But just as a general principle, they've done pretty well with what they've spent. But they've fallen behind the times in what they've spent. Because it's one thing to be sitting at the payroll level that they are right now, which not that long ago would have made you, maybe number 6, number 7 in the majors. Now it's more like 15th or 16th. That's because the big boys have been rolling up their sleeves and spending a lot more money, with Steve Cohen at the forefront of that. So the Cardinals model worked when you had a $150 million payroll, maybe a little more, or actually a lot of times they didn't even have that. But again, it was a different time. There wasn't yet not this crazy payroll escalation we've seen the last couple of years. But anyway, it's one thing where you could be top 10, maybe 11th, maybe 9th. And, you could compete with anybody, even with some of the mistakes they have made, the Cardinals, with their spending. Well, that gap is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and other teams have committed more financial resources to their payroll. We just mentioned some teams that, at least so far, it hasn't worked out that great, but that doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. Padres, Phillies, Mets, really big spenders. It's working out okay for the Rangers. Got a new manager in there, got a lot of good things going for them. They have an immense talent. They're 40-21, and the best series of the weekend in Major League Baseball, the Rangers and Tampa Bay, 2 best teams record-wise in the majors. And the Tampa Bay Rays absolutely prove you don't need to spend $200 million or $265 million. You don't even have to spend where they are. I mean, you don't even have to spend $125 million or $100 million because they're smarter as a baseball group, a baseball operation. They're smarter than everybody else. So this stuff fascinates me. The Braves have spent a lot of money. It's worked for them. The Yankees have spent a lot of money. But how do we define success for the Yankees? They get in the playoffs every year, just like the Cardinals have been doing, although the Yankees have done it more consistently. They haven't won a World Series since 2009. I mean, we locally, as the weeks and the months and the years go by, we make more of a bigger deal each year about the Cardinals not having won a World Series since 2011. Can you even count up the billions of dollars in payroll the Yankees have spent since winning that World Series in 2009? They haven't. In fact, I should know this off the top of my head, but they really haven't gotten all that close to getting back to the World Series. That's the thing. So what the Cardinals have gone through. Now, listen, the Yankees haven't gone through this, being 11 games under 500 on June the 9th, but in terms of postseason flops, which the Cardinals have experienced all too often, well, the Yankees have pretty much been doing the same thing, except they've spent a gazillion dollars. So I always talk about this with Cardinals fans. I think they get mad at me. I don't want them to about this, but it's like, I'm going to make the point again. Some of the worst things the Cardinals have done is spend money. I mean, we could sit here, probably take up 15 minutes, like reciting all the mistakes where they really did invest. Brett Cecil, Mike Leake, extending Matt Carpenter, Dexter Fowler, to a lesser extent, Andrew Miller. I mean, Contreras isn't off to a great start, but again, I'm not going to overreact to that. But the Cardinals seem to get into trouble when they do throw a little money around. That doesn't mean they shouldn't, and I think Bill DeWitt needs to raise the payroll. More than anything, Bill DeWitt, if this is possible, has to get over this notion, because now we hear John Mozeliak talking about it all the time. Well, we pursued starters, but all those guys that we pursued, we didn't get. They're all hurt or they're not pitching well. I don't know how to answer that because, listen, pitchers break down more in baseball than they ever have. I mean, every single year, pitching injuries go up. In fact, the early pace this year is absurd. There's so many pitching injuries. But does that mean you should just sit on the sidelines forever? I mean, you're going to roll the dice. You're going to take your chances. And I agree. I'm not going to sit here and be a phony. I understand why you got to think hard about spending 100, 150 million or more on a starting pitcher. But you can't live in fear if you've done your work properly and you've done your research properly and you've vetted a starting pitcher from a medical standpoint and the length of or the likelihood of injury standpoint, and there are ways to do that, then you should have confidence in what you have decided to do. But when Mozeliak talks about that stuff, it really rankles me because I know you know it's obvious, like some of the people they're talking about, you know, some of the top, I would say the upper crust of starting pitchers that were available this past offseason, maybe the last two off seasons. But number one, they can use the word pursue or pursued, and it's meaningless because are you really pursuing a top pitcher when it's obvious, 100% obvious and certain, you're never going to pay the money that pitcher can get from other teams? So how exactly are you pursuing him? Because you make a phone call? I don't think that counts. You stay in touch with his agent? I don't think that gets it done. It's money, baby. And if they're reluctant to spend big on a top of the rotation type guy, well, what about starting pitchers that didn't cost a fortune who are thriving elsewhere, and pitchers that, you know, have been discussed in St. Louis before? You know, John Gray is one. Nathan Eovaldi's one. I mean, I could go on. You can still find, and the word value is relative to the escalation of payrolls. You can still find really good starting pitchers at a so-called, quote, value price. You know, the Cardinals were never going to sign Carlos Rodon. They were never going to sign DeGrom. They were going to sign Verlander. I mean, who else am I leaving out? It just wasn't going to happen. So it's frustrating, but just because you are not in the hunt and you never had a chance because you weren't willing to pay the going price, the going rate for a top one or top two starter, right? Does that justify not doing anything about your rotation? No, it does not. So I'm not even sure what their point is. All of the hell raising we've all done. I mean, media, fans, probably some Cardinals players in their private moments about how many years in a row do you go into the season with overestimating, overrating, and overcounting on the starting pitchers you have, somehow believing that they're going to all of a sudden be much better than their track record shows. You know, I'm going to be really blunt here. When you know you have all these starting pitching issues historically, and you always got to go out and scramble for help, did it make sense from a baseball standpoint? Did it make sense to give it an $18 million one-year deal to a 42-year-old pitcher who crashed and burned at the end of last season? I mean, I'm just looking at it from a pragmatic standpoint. You know, they don't want to spend on this. They don't want to spend that. They don't want to pursue John Gray. That, you know, but okay, they gave Adam Wainwright $18 million. I'm not even saying he doesn't deserve it. Well, first of all, you deserve whatever somebody's willing to pay you. But from a pure baseball standpoint and how it affects your starting pitching for this year, I'm sorry. I mean, and I know there's more to baseball than just business, but if we are talking competitive baseball, if we're ripping the Cardinals as we should for not fixing their starting rotation, not going into the new year, the next year, with an improved rotation based on moves they made by going outside of the organization instead of like sort of the same cast. And they did sign Steven Matz, and that's another point. I mentioned the guys they've spent money on who have not come through, and you almost forget about Matz because, he's been such a non-factor. He's in the bullpen. I mean, that was $44 million. So, we always holler about, they should spend this, spend that, spend that. Well, they get into trouble when they do, which actually is just another failure by the front office. They really don't seem to know anymore how to value players and make those sound judgments, even when they're throwing some money around. But there's no excuse for doing nothing and just like sitting there all cocky and arrogant and complacent. Oh, I think Mo said something at one point, early season interview or late in spring training. Well, we have 8 starting pitchers. You do? I'm hoping Jordan Montgomery gets back on track starting tonight, and gets really back on track to what we saw from him last year until the very end, where he fizzled a little bit. But if right now they got 2 starting pitchers that are going well, and Montgomery's kind of on the borderline. I mean, his overall ERA ain't bad, but I'm talking about the trend. You're sitting here as a Cardinal fan, and and you're crossing your fingers or whatever you do for good luck, and just like, well, okay, a couple of their guys. Miklasz has been doing good after his first 3 starts, and Flaherty has been much better, even with the walks. He fights through it. His last 5-6 starts, he's got the 5th best starting pitching ERA in the majors. But it's like, okay, well, that's not enough. Who's the 3rd guy? Well, it might be Montgomery. They need it to be Montgomery. The Cardinals are just at a very perplexing time. That's why not to wear this out, but that's why, I drew the parallel between them and Blackberry. Blackberry's on top of the world. And had 80, almost 90 million subscribers, and none of their competitors were close. They weren't doing anything, and then all of a sudden, Apple said, Steve Jobs said, "Wait a minute now, there's money to be made in them hills." And the guys at and I assume women as well, who were running BlackBerry, just thought, we're at the top of the world. Nobody can touch us. Put their feet up, had a cigar, maybe a cocktail. And all of a sudden, they're down to 28 million. And then they're starting to sell off pieces of their business. And it happened in about 30 seconds. That's where DeWitt and Mozeliak are. They had a lot of success. I mean, great success, really, for a long period of time. But they have not changed their model. They have not adjusted with the times. They still think the way they've been doing things will lead them to the promised land. And to that we say, what? How many postseason games have they won since 2015? Not many. Not many at all. Maybe like 11, if that. So that's what happens when, even though you're smart and your intelligence has put you near the top of the heap for quite a long period of time, you can fall from near the top of the heap if you don't update your model and change with the times. Isn't that the case with other businesses? I'm not even talking about sports. You don't think automakers have had to, especially when Japan's automakers were just sort of blowing the U.S. out for a time in the 80s? There's a great book about that called The Reckoning. How Japan took over the auto industry and actually, sent the U.S. auto industry to its knees. You don't think automakers realize they've got to update constantly and make sure they're ahead of the curve, or at least keeping pace with the trend? I mean, you can name any major business you want. It's true of all those businesses. So why, with all due respect to Bill DeWitt, and I do respect him, why does he think that it does? These rules of business do not apply to him? They've kind of just really fallen behind the times, and philosophically. And I'm not saying these are dumb people. Of course not. They're stubborn, and they've also been, as I've said a lot, they've also been living off the welfare of these charity cases in the NL Central for too long. These people, you look at the Cardinals' record now, 26-37. What would it be if they'd been competing in some of these other divisions for a while? You think they would have been in the playoffs in 2021? Probably not. 22? No, absolutely not. Because I remind you, last season they had a 45-41 record outside the NL Central. So The Cardinals are going to look after the season, whether they win or lose. And the thing of it is, this sounds bad. And I'll be happy for them to make the playoffs. It's still nice to make the playoffs. And it's the only chance you have to go win other things. But in some respects, one of the worst things actually for an organization that will not evolve, it will not change to fit the times. It will not adjust the payroll or the thinking. If they somehow put something together and the other teams in the Central fall apart and the Cardinals, somehow win the division like 82 wins or something, they're just going to think, see, we know what we're doing. You kind of do, but there's other parts that you don't do very well anymore. And it's got to change. The organizational philosophy's got to change. So that was a good speech. Took a while. Good speech. Anyway, the couple things. Number one, I don't get into the buyer-seller thing. It's too early. And I wrote a piece at scoopswithdannymac.com, and some of it's I've talked about at length here on the Bernie Show. So what do the Cardinals need to do other than hope that other teams in the NL Central fall apart? What do they need to do to close that 8.5 game gap? And as I was saying when I was writing this piece, I was kind of laughing to myself. I said, okay, what do they have to do? All right, here are some answers that are not permitted or accepted. We got to fire them all. Got to fire them all. DeWitt's got to sell. No, that's not what we're talking about here. Marmel's not going to be fired this season. John Mozeliak reiterated that to Katie Wu, the Athletic, earlier this week. I mean, he said the stuff he said about Marmol. I mean, anybody who thinks that this is actually a possibility he'll be fired this season, I'm sorry. You're probably smart in many other areas, but if you think that there's really a possibility he'll get sacked during the season, you're cuckoo. It ain't going to happen. Same with Mozeliak. Bill DeWitt gave him a 2-year contract extension in spring training that runs through the 2025 season. And as I've said 100,000 times, they are a partnership. DeWitt loves Mozeliak. They work well together. They work closely together. He's not going to bail on Mozeliak after giving him a 2-year deal. The people say, well, he fired Walt Jocketty. Yeah, he fired Walt Jocketty because Walt Jocketty, who's a friend of mine, kind of went on strike. I mean, he was so offended by the Jeff Luhnow hiring and the fact that Bill DeWitt gave Jeff Luhnow so much authority. And as time went on, because he was hired in 2003, as time went on, before Walt was fired or after the 2007 season, Luhnow had gained more and more power. And Walt was just furious. And Walt just wouldn't accept it. He wouldn't stand down. And basically DeWitt just look, man, this guy's he's not going to get with the program, and because we have to do things differently. And actually, he was right. I mean, you can't. It was a different time when it was easier to make the kind of trades that Jocketty made. But I didn't want to get into that. My point is just to address it. Say, well, what do you mean he can't fire Bo? He fired Jocketty a season after he won the World Series. Yeah, but it was for entirely different reasons. Same reasons in a way that Mike Schilt was sacked for. Like it or not, I know it's hard for some to believe, like it or not, everybody's got a boss. Everybody's got a boss, and chances are the boss got a lot of power, a lot of juice. Boss ain't going anywhere. So if you're going to stage a rebellion as a manager, you going to go out there and stage a rebellion against the owner's president of baseball operations who has a massive power? So you're going to stage a rebellion. That's it. You're going to tell them how is it going to be? No, we're going to do this. Oh, okay. Yeah. And to this day, people are like, I don't understand why they fired him. At the risk of being a real smartass, well, do you have a job? And I mean that not insultingly, but if you have a job, you have a boss. In a lot of places, you got a powerful boss who's clearly in charge. who's clearly setting the thing up the way he wants to, whether it be advanced analytics or whatever it may be. You're not going to win the rebellion, so why are you even trying? I mean, that is a huge ego eruption to think that you're going to win a rebellion against Bill DeWitt's guy in terms of the baseball operation. It ain't going to happen. People are like, well, I don't understand why you got fired. Uncle Bernie here told you about 2-3 days later after I did my intel gathering. Decided to start a like power struggle or something, whatever in his mind, where he was going to tell Mozeliak, no, this is what I want. This is what we're going to do. You know who never did that? I'll tell you who never did that, Tony La Russa. Would Tony La Russa push Bill DeWitt and John Mozeliak? Of course he would. Would he go in there with ideas and said, hey, I really think we ought to do this, and here's why? And they would listen to him, and they would talk about it. And if they said, listen, we don't think that's a good idea. La Russa may have not liked it, but he accepted it because, as he told me a bunch of times, listen, doesn't matter how much I've won, doesn't matter how much they're paying me, doesn't matter what my reputation is. I got a boss. I got an owner. They treat me well, they pay me well, and ultimately they get the final decision. And once that decision's made, I respect it. I might kind of pout about it for a little bit, but I respect it. You know, this whole thing like, well, you know, Tony La Russa was pushing those guys. No, he wasn't. I used to have off-the-record conversations of some of the things he really wanted to do and he really pushed for. And I'll be honest with you, I love Tony, man. Much respect to him. But some of the things, it was kind of like, really? Are you sure? You know, there were some things where I like wondered, like, well, man, I'd kind of walk out of his office after an off-the-record session and say, you know, I hope they say no, because I don't think that's a good idea. Anyway, that's just the way it is. I mean, DeWitt owns the franchise. He's actively involved in baseball decisions, very much so. He works in tandem with Mozeliak, and Mozeliak picked the manager, and Mozeliak believes in the manager. Now, you don't have to agree with it. You can say they're wrong, or I'm not going to buy any more tickets until this gang goes. You can say all that. But the idea that any solution for right now in 2023, with 99 games to go, the thought that somehow they're going to fight, you know, DeWitt's going to sack Mo, and, you know, they're going to sack Marmol. Zero chance of that happening this year. So we can fume and complain. And by the way, do I hesitate to criticize these people? No, I don't. But I understand that no one's going to be fired. And I don't see any reason to raise my blood pressure over that. Now, after the season, if it continues to be a disaster, they better take a hard look at everything. But they're not going to do that during the season. That's my point. I hope you understand the point I'm trying to make. And I'm making it sincerely, in total sincerity, and with updated knowledge of those particular situations. Not going to happen. So there's other ways they can improve, and we will get into some of that after we talk to R.J. Anderson. They still got to clean up their defense. They've got to sharpen their base running. They're too cautious. They're going to have to make upgrades through the trade market. And I don't do fantasy trades, so I'm not saying, well, let's talk about what it would take to get this guy. I don't play that game. Besides, just like the whole sellers buyers thing, it's stupid. It's too early. You realize all the things that can happen to potential trade targets, and with your own players who would be traded, or the state of your team, or the state of the team that you'd like to get a player from. You realize how many times that can change between now and, say, mid-July or third week of July? What's the point of playing the buyer-seller game? You maybe for amusement, that's all right. But I don't want to just get caught up in it because I got other things to talk about that are more relevant to right now. But the Cardinals can do some things, and again, I promise we'll get to that in our remaining time after we talk to R.J. Anderson. But I mentioned a few of them. Going to have to upgrade the pitching, bullpen, and starters probably. They're going to have to make a tough decision on Wainwright if he continues to not pitch well. Not for a moment. See, I'm applying my own belief to this. I can say, like, well, listen, if they're really serious and Wainwright's got, carrying a 6.15 ERA around or whatever, that's they should do something about that. They're going to have to do something about that. Just like many of you are saying, they got to fire them all. They got to fire Mo. Okay. I don't think for 1 second that they would ever pull Wainwright out of the rotation this year for obvious reasons. So things are a little complicated. It's not always black, white, all, nothing. There's a lot of shades of gray, and there's a lot of you get tangled up when you have a venerated player of your franchise, second greatest pitcher starting pitcher in the history of the franchise. It's not as easy as saying once you commit to him for this year, it's like, well, his ERA's high. They got to get him out of there. Pragmatically, yeah. From a baseball standpoint, yeah. But is it going to happen? No. Unless he's injured or something. All right.